There are nights when the world quietly decides a story is over and no one dares to question it, until someone invisible does. The rain came down like it meant to erase everything in Chicago that night, pounding the streets, flooding the sidewalks, turning every shadow into something colder, heavier. People rushed past glass doors and glowing lights, hiding inside warmth that didn't belong to everyone. Outside, pressed against the edge of that warmth, stood a boy who had long ago stopped expecting anything from the world. Eli Mercer was 14, but life had carved something older into his eyes. His clothes clung to him, soaked and stiff, his fingers cracked from cold nights spent behind places no one looked twice at. Hunger wasn't new to him. It was constant, like breathing, like the quiet ache in his chest that never really went away. He didn't beg, didn't call out, didn't chase pity. He just watched, the way someone watches a life they know they'll never touch. The hospital doors slid open and closed in front of him, each time releasing a brief wave of heat, of light, of something that felt like another world entirely. People walked in carrying hope, or fear, or urgency, but always belonging to somewhere. Eli didn't belong anywhere anymore. Still, he didn't leave. Something kept him rooted there, even as the rain soaked deeper into his bones. Inside, beyond polished floors and bright corridors, a different kind of storm was unfolding. Silent, controlled, but far more final. In one isolated room, machines hummed with a rhythm that was already fading. Doctors stood still, their faces set in the quiet acceptance that comes when nothing more can be done. No rushing, no shouting, just the slow, heavy pause before an ending is spoken out loud. On the bed lay Noah Caldwell, 8 months old, his body small beneath a web of tubes and wires that seemed far too large for him. His chest barely moved, as if each breath had to be borrowed from something already running out. Monitors flickered with numbers that told a story the room didn't want to hear, but understood all too well. At the edge of that bed stood his father, Daniel Caldwell, a man the world knew as untouchable. Wealth, influence, power. None of it mattered in that moment. Months earlier, he had already stood at another bedside, already watched life slip away from someone he loved. Now, history was repeating itself with cruel precision, stripping away everything he thought could protect him. The doctor's hands slowed. His gaze lingered on the monitor just a moment too long, as if searching for something that refused to appear. Then came the quiet shift, the kind that changes everything without making a sound. Gloves removed. Shoulders lowered. The unspoken decision settled into the room like a weight no one could lift. Time, for them, had run out. Outside, Eli shivered harder, his body begging him to move, to find shelter, to survive another night the only way he knew how. But something pulled at him. Something he didn't understand, something stronger than instinct. He stepped closer to the entrance, his eyes drawn not to the people, not to the warmth, but to a single room beyond the glass, glowing brighter than the rest. He shouldn't have gone in. Everything about that place told him he didn't belong. But belonging had stopped mattering a long time ago. Inside, grief was already beginning to break open. A father collapsing under the weight of loss. A room preparing to let go. A life about to be labeled as finished. And just before everything crossed that final line, a boy no one saw took one step forward. What happened next didn't begin with noise or chaos. It began with something so small that every trained eye in the room had already dismissed it. Eli stood just inside the doorway, soaked, unnoticed, completely out of place among polished floors and controlled despair. No one paid attention to him, because there was nothing left to pay attention to. The outcome had already been accepted. The machines had told their story. The doctors had reached their conclusion. The room was already moving on from hope. But Eli wasn't looking at the machines. He was looking at the baby. To everyone else, Noah Caldwell lay still, suspended in a silence that had already been labeled as final. But Eli had lived too long in spaces where silence lied. He had learned, through hunger and cold and nights that refused to end, that life didn't always disappear the way people expected it to. Sometimes it hid. Sometimes it flickered so faintly that only someone who had nearly lost it themselves would recognize it. And in that fragile stillness, Eli saw it, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement at the corner of the baby's mouth. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't enough to trigger alarms or change numbers on a screen. It was the kind of movement that could be explained away, ignored, forgotten. And that's exactly what everyone else did. But Eli couldn't. Something inside him tightened, sharp and immediate. His heartbeat surged, not from fear, but from certainty, the kind that doesn't ask permission, doesn't wait for validation. It simply exists. The room continued as if nothing had happened. A nurse moved toward the machines. A doctor turned slightly away. A father remained collapsed in a grief too heavy to question anything anymore. And Eli realized in that instant that if he did nothing, the world would close the door on a life that wasn't finished yet. He stepped forward. It wasn't a careful decision. It wasn't logical. It was raw instinct colliding with something deeper. Something shaped by every moment he had ever been ignored, overlooked, dismissed. He knew what it felt like to be treated as if you were already gone. And he refused to let that happen again, not here, not now. The space around him shifted too late. Someone noticed movement. Someone reacted. But Eli was already moving faster than hesitation. He crossed the room in a blur of soaked fabric and trembling resolve, reaching the bed before anyone could stop him. The wires, the tubes, the machines, all the things that defined control in that room, became obstacles he didn't recognize as untouchable. Everything exploded at once. Alarms shattered the silence. Voices rose sharply, cutting through the sterile calm. Footsteps rushed forward. But Eli didn't stop. He didn't look at them, didn't hear them, not in any way that mattered. All he could see was the baby. All he could feel was the fading edge of something that wasn't gone yet. He lifted Noah with a care that came from memory, not training. From somewhere deep in his past, buried beneath survival and loss, there was still a trace of how to hold something fragile. His hands adjusted instinctively, steady despite the chaos erupting around him. The world tried to pull him back, hands reaching, voices demanding, authority crashing down, but Eli moved through it like it didn't exist. He turned, not toward escape, but toward the nearest sink. Not because he had a plan, but because something inside him told him what needed to happen next. It wasn't knowledge taught in classrooms. It was something older, something felt rather than understood. Water rushed. Cold. Immediate. Real. Eli angled the baby forward, careful, deliberate in a way that didn't match his trembling body. Time stretched, warped, slowed into something unbearable. Every second dragged, heavy with doubt pressing in from every side. Nothing happened. For a moment, the room seemed to win. The noise, the certainty, the overwhelming force of everything telling him he was wrong. It all crashed down at once. But Eli didn't stop. He held on. Because he had nothing else to believe in except the possibility that he wasn't too late. And then, a break. Small. Violent. Real. The baby's body reacted, coughing weakly, forcing something out that had been trapped where it shouldn't have been. Water spilled. Air struggled in. Another cough followed, sharper this time, cutting through the chaos like something undeniable. The room froze. Not gradually. Not uncertainly. Completely. Because the sound that came next didn't belong in a place where an ending had already been declared. A cry. Thin. Fragile. But alive. Everything stopped meaning what it had meant seconds before. The alarms were no longer warnings. They were witnesses. The doctors were no longer certain. They were searching. The father was no longer broken. He was staring, caught between disbelief and something dangerously close to hope. And at the center of it all stood a boy no one had seen before that moment, holding the line between death and life with nothing but instinct and refusal. Eli didn't understand what he had done. He didn't think of it as saving someone. He didn't think of it as impossible. He only knew one thing. He hadn't walked away. And somehow, that had been enough to change everything. The cry didn't just fill the room, it shattered everything inside it. For a fraction of time that felt longer than anything before, no one moved. The sound hung there, fragile but undeniable, cutting through years of training, protocols, and conclusions that had already been sealed. What had been declared finished was now forcing its way back into existence, and no one in that room was prepared for what that meant. Then everything surged at once. Doctors rushed forward, their precision returning in bursts, hands moving quickly but no longer with certainty, now with urgency mixed with disbelief. Nurses repositioned equipment, restarting systems that had already been abandoned. The machines flickered back to life, their screens no longer flat with finality but unstable, searching, reacting. Noah's body responded in fragments. His chest rose unevenly, each breath shallow and uncertain, as if the world itself had to relearn how to hold him. His fingers twitched, barely noticeable, but enough to pull every eye back to him. The monitors began to climb in hesitant increments, numbers shifting from nothing into something fragile, something real. It didn't make sense. Nothing about it fit into the logic that had governed the room just moments before. The lead physician stood frozen for a heartbeat too long, staring at the monitor as if it might betray him again. Years of experience told him what he had already accepted. What he was seeing now did not belong in that understanding. And yet the evidence was right there, pulsing weakly but persistently in front of him. Around the bed, the atmosphere changed from controlled grief to controlled chaos. Instructions were given faster, sharper. Movements overlapped. Every second mattered again, but this time, not in preparation for an ending, but in a desperate attempt to hold onto something that had unexpectedly returned. In the corner of the room, Eli stood alone. His arms had been pulled away, his body guided back by hands that no longer knew whether to restrain him or thank him. Water dripped steadily from his clothes onto the polished floor, forming a small, quiet pool beneath him. His breathing was uneven, not from the sprint or the struggle, but from the overwhelming weight of what had just happened. He wasn't looking at the doctors. He wasn't looking at the machines. His eyes stayed locked on the baby. Because in that moment, none of the noise mattered to him. The shouting, the alarms, the rushing bodies. It all blurred into something distant. All that mattered was that the tiny chest was still moving, however weakly. That the silence he had refused to accept had not come back. Across the room, Daniel Caldwell slowly rose. Grief had not left him. It had simply transformed into something sharper, more dangerous. Hope, after loss, does not arrive gently. It arrives with hesitation, with fear, with the constant expectation that it will be taken away again. He moved toward the bed, each step heavy, uncertain, as if the ground itself might shift beneath him. His eyes never left his son. He watched the rise and fall of that fragile chest as though it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. The doctors worked quickly, reconnecting tubes, stabilizing systems, rebuilding what had already been dismantled. But something had changed, not just in the patient, but in the room itself. Because now there was a question none of them could answer. How? The scans would come later. The data would be reviewed. Every step would be retraced in search of a mistake, an overlooked factor, a missed detail that could explain what had just occurred. But in that moment, there was only one undeniable fact. The child they had declared gone was alive. And standing just a few feet away was the one variable they had never accounted for. Daniel turned his gaze slowly toward Eli. Up close, the boy looked even smaller than before. The sharp angles of his face, the dirt beneath his nails, the faint scars along his arms. Every detail told a story of survival, not belonging. His clothes hung loosely, worn thin by time and weather. His eyes held something deeper than fear, something older than his years. There was no triumph in them. No pride. Only a quiet, guarded uncertainty, as if he were waiting for the world to correct itself and take everything back. Daniel studied him in silence, the weight of what had just happened pressing against every thought. Wealth had given him access to the best doctors, the most advanced technology, every possible advantage. And yet none of it had been enough. Until this boy had stepped in. Across the room, the medical team began to stabilize Noah more fully. Oxygen levels climbed slowly, irregular but improving. The heartbeat found a rhythm, weak but consistent. Brain activity flickered back onto the monitors, faint signals that suggested something had not been lost after all, only buried beneath the surface. The impossible was not just a moment anymore. It was holding. Still, no one spoke of miracles. Not yet. Not in a place built on explanation. Instead, there were hushed exchanges, glances shared between professionals who had spent their lives trusting certainty. Now, that certainty had cracked, and through it, something they couldn't define had emerged. Eli remained where he was, unmoving. The adrenaline that had driven him forward was fading, replaced by something colder. Doubt crept in at the edges. Not about what he had seen, but about whether he had done something wrong. Whether the world would turn against him for crossing a line he wasn't supposed to cross. He had spent his life learning that actions had consequences, especially for people like him. And yet, no one was pushing him out now. No one was shouting anymore. Instead, there was a strange pause, a space where judgment should have been, but wasn't. Because everyone in that room had seen the same thing. And none of them could deny it. The night that had begun with certainty was no longer predictable. The ending that had been written had been torn apart, replaced with something fragile, uncertain, and far more dangerous. Hope. And at the center of it stood a boy who had never been given any, now carrying more of it than anyone else in the room. The storm outside eventually faded, but inside that hospital, nothing returned to the way it had been. What began as a moment of chaos slowly settled into something far more unsettling, uncertainty that refused to leave. The machines around Noah no longer signaled an ending, they measured a fragile return. Every number on the screen climbed with hesitation, as if even the technology wasn't fully convinced of what it was witnessing. Doctors moved carefully now, not with the authority of certainty, but with the restraint of people who had been proven wrong once already. No one said it out loud, but the room had changed its center. It was no longer just the child on the bed. It was also the boy standing quietly in the corner. Eli hadn't moved much since everything happened. The cold that had once defined his night was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar: warm air, dry floors, and eyes that no longer ignored him. But this wasn't comfort. It was exposure. For someone who had survived by blending into the background, being seen felt more dangerous than being invisible. A nurse eventually approached him, slower than she would have before, as if unsure of how to treat him now. Not as a problem to remove, not as a stranger to push away, but not quite as someone who belonged either. She guided him to a chair, placed food in front of him, and stepped back. Eli stared at it for a long moment before touching anything. Hunger had always been immediate, uncontrollable. But now, something else interfered: hesitation. The quiet fear that anything given could be taken away just as quickly. When he finally ate, it wasn't with urgency. It was careful, measured, as if he needed to make sure the moment was real before allowing himself to believe in it. Across the room, Noah stabilized further. The small signs came slowly. A steadier rhythm. A deeper breath. A faint movement that would have gone unnoticed on any other day, but now carried weight far beyond its size. The medical team documented everything, double-checked every reading, ran tests that returned answers they didn't know how to interpret. Nothing explained the shift. Not the timing. Not the response. Not the fact that it had all begun the moment Eli refused to accept the outcome. The word miracle hovered unspoken, avoided by those trained to distrust it. Instead, they searched for patterns, causes, logic, anything that could bring the situation back under control. But every path led back to the same point. The interruption. The boy. Daniel Caldwell hadn't left. He remained near the bed at first, watching his son with a focus so intense it blocked out everything else. But gradually, his attention shifted. Not away from Noah, but outward, toward the presence that had altered everything. He studied Eli from a distance before approaching. Up close, the reality was harder to ignore. This wasn't someone shaped by opportunity or protection. This was someone who had endured. Every detail, the posture, the guarded movements, the instinct to shrink slightly when noticed, spoke of a life built around survival, not safety. And yet, that same boy had acted without hesitation in a room full of people who had already given up. Daniel's world had always been structured around control. Problems had solutions. Risks had strategies. Outcomes could be influenced, predicted, managed. But this had bypassed all of it. Eli sat with his shoulders slightly hunched, hands resting near the edge of the tray, as if ready to pull away at any moment. His eyes flicked occasionally toward the bed, checking, confirming, grounding himself in the one thing that made sense. The child was still alive. That was enough. Hours passed. The hospital quieted into the low hum of night routines, but Noah's room remained active. Observations continued. Adjustments were made. Each small improvement added to something that no one fully understood, but no one dared to interrupt. Eli remained there through all of it. No one told him to leave. That, more than anything, felt unreal. Outside, the city moved on. The rain washed the streets clean, carrying away the traces of a night that should have ended like so many others. But inside, something had shifted permanently. A line had been crossed. Eli had spent years existing on the edges of places like this, close enough to see, never close enough to belong. Hospitals had been sources of scraps, of fleeting kindness, of rejection when he stayed too long. They were not places where someone like him remained. And yet, he was still there. Not hidden. Not pushed out. Just there. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't bracing for the moment everything would be taken away. But that didn't mean he trusted it. Not yet. Trust, for Eli, wasn't something that appeared suddenly. It had been broken too many times, worn down by too many nights where survival depended on expecting the worst. So he stayed quiet. Watched. Waited. And near the center of it all, Noah continued to hold on. Each breath came easier than the last. Each movement carried a little more strength. It wasn't a full recovery, not even close, but it was undeniable progress. Enough to keep everyone there, to keep hope alive, to keep the question unanswered. Why? The doctors would keep searching for explanations. The world outside would eventually hear about what happened. Stories would form, opinions would clash, meanings would be assigned. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Because something far simpler, far more immediate, was unfolding. A boy who had never had a place was being allowed to stay. And no one in that room fully understood why that felt just as important as the life he had helped save. Time didn't rush forward after that night. It moved carefully, almost cautiously, as if afraid that going too fast might undo what had been given back. Days turned into weeks inside that hospital, and something unusual began to take shape, something no chart could fully capture. Noah's recovery didn't follow the patterns the doctors expected. It wasn't steady in the way medicine preferred. It came in quiet, uneven steps, each one small, almost fragile, but impossible to ignore once it happened. A finger curling around nothing. An eye opening for a second too long to be random. A breath that didn't struggle as much as the one before it. Individually, each sign could be dismissed. Together, they formed a truth no one could argue with anymore. He was coming back. But what unsettled the medical team wasn't just the recovery, it was the condition surrounding it. Because there was one variable that kept repeating itself with quiet consistency. Eli. He was there every day. No one assigned him that role. No one asked him to stay. And yet he did, drawn back to the same chair beside the bed as if something tethered him there. He didn't interfere anymore. He didn't cross lines or challenge authority. He simply remained, watching, sitting, existing in a space that had somehow opened for him. And Noah responded. Not in dramatic ways. Not in anything that would make headlines on its own. But in patterns that became harder to ignore with each passing day. When Eli was near, the child's body seemed to settle. The erratic fluctuations smoothed. The tension eased. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't always obvious, but it was there. Doctors noticed. At first, they resisted the idea. Correlation wasn't causation. Coincidence could explain many things. But medicine is built on observation, and the pattern refused to disappear no matter how many times they tried to dismiss it. When Eli left the room, the numbers often wavered. When he returned, they steadied. It wasn't predictable enough to prove, but it was consistent enough to haunt. So they stopped questioning his presence. They allowed it. Daniel Caldwell saw it more clearly than anyone. At first, his attention had been fixed entirely on his son, every improvement a fragile victory he didn't dare celebrate too loudly. But as the days passed, his perspective widened. He began to see not just what was happening to Noah, but what was happening around him. Eli wasn't just a visitor. He was part of the recovery. The realization came slowly, built from moments that didn't seem significant on their own. The way Noah's breathing eased when Eli sat close. The subtle shifts in expression when Eli spoke softly about things no one else thought to mention. Stories about stars seen from empty streets. Nights endured without walls or warmth. A world Noah had never known, but somehow responded to. It didn't make sense. And yet, it worked. Eli didn't notice the attention at first. For him, the hospital had become something unfamiliar but steady. A place where he wasn't chased away, where food appeared without conditions, where a bed existed that didn't vanish when he woke up. But even that wasn't what kept him there. It was Noah. There was something in that small, fragile life that felt connected. Not in a way Eli could explain, but in a way he could feel. Maybe it was because he had stood so close to losing everything once himself. Maybe it was because he understood, in a way no one else in that room could, what it meant to fight when the world had already decided you were done. So he stayed. Not as a hero. Not as a miracle. Just as someone who refused to leave. But while Noah's body grew stronger, Eli's past didn't disappear. It waited. It showed itself in small, quiet ways at first. The way he ate slowly, even when food was always there. The way he kept pieces of bread hidden, tucked away instinctively as if preparing for a hunger that never came anymore. The way he flinched at sudden movements or raised voices, his body reacting before his mind could remind him he was safe. The hospital saw it. Daniel saw it. And slowly, the focus shifted again. Not away from Noah, but outward, toward the boy who had changed everything. Because saving a life doesn't erase the damage of surviving your own. One afternoon, The balance between them became undeniable. Rain returned to the city, heavy and cold, striking against the hospital windows with a familiar rhythm. It should have been nothing, just another storm passing through Chicago. But for Eli, it wasn't just rain. It was memory. The sound, the smell, the weight of it all crashed into him at once. The nights behind dumpsters. The hunger that twisted his stomach until it felt like it would break him. The cold that never let him sleep.
The feeling of being unseen, unwanted, forgotten.
It hit without warning. His breath shortened. His vision blurred. The room that had begun to feel stable shifted into something unfamiliar again. Safe turned into uncertain. Present turned into past. And for the first time since that night, Eli faltered. Not in action. Not in courage. But in himself. His body gave in to something he had held back for too long. He dropped, not because he chose to, but because he couldn't hold himself up anymore. The room reacted, but not fast enough to reach him first. Because someone else already had. Noah. Still small. Still recovering. Still far from fully strong. And yet, somehow, he was the one who closed the distance. The one who reached out, bridging something that had begun weeks earlier without anyone fully understanding it. What Eli had given that night was being returned. Not in the same way. Not with the same urgency. But with the same truth. Healing doesn't move in one direction. It circles back. And in that moment, the boy who had refused to let another life slip away was finally forced to face the one he had nearly lost himself. Not to death. But to everything that came before it. And for the first time he didn't face it alone. What began in a single moment of refusal did not end in that hospital room. It unfolded slowly, shaping lives in ways no one could have predicted, and in ways no headline could ever fully capture. Noah continued to recover, not all at once, not in some sudden, dramatic transformation, but through a series of quiet victories that demanded patience from everyone around him. First came stability, then control, then strength in small movements that gradually turned into intention. Each step forward felt fragile, as if it could disappear if anyone looked at it too closely, but it didn't. It held. And with every step Noah took, Eli changed too. He didn't return to the streets. Not that night. Not ever again. Daniel Caldwell made the decision without hesitation, but not out of gratitude alone. It wasn't about repaying a miracle. It was about recognizing something deeper, something that had nothing to do with wealth or circumstance. Eli had stepped into a moment where everyone else had stepped back. He had acted when certainty said there was nothing left to do. That kind of instinct didn't come from chance. It came from experience, from pain, from understanding what it meant to disappear in plain sight. So Eli stayed. At first, it felt temporary, like everything else in his life had always been. A clean bed that might vanish. Meals that might stop. Walls that might push him out the moment he relaxed. He moved carefully through the Caldwell home, never fully touching anything, never fully believing it belonged to him. Even in warmth, he carried the cold with him. Nights were the hardest. Sleep didn't come easily when your body had learned to stay alert. Eli kept the light on for weeks, unable to trust the dark. He woke suddenly, breath tight, heart racing, unsure of where he was. Sometimes he checked the corners of the room as if expecting something to be there. Sometimes he hid food without realizing he was doing it, instinct stronger than logic. But this time, no one took it away. Daniel watched without forcing change, without correcting habits that had once kept Eli alive. He understood now, in a way he never had before, that survival leaves marks that don't fade just because circumstances improve. Healing doesn't erase, it rebuilds. And slowly, almost invisibly, Eli began to adjust. The first time he slept through the night without waking, he didn't even notice it until morning. The first time he left food uneaten and didn't hide it, he paused, confused by his own behavior. These weren't big moments. No one celebrated them. But they mattered more than anything else. Because they meant something inside him was finally letting go. Meanwhile, Noah grew stronger. The child who had once hovered at the edge of death began to reclaim space in the world. Sitting came first, unsteady but determined. Then standing, with help, legs trembling under a weight they had never carried before. Laughter followed, not loud at first but real, echoing through rooms that had once held only fear. Doctors continued to visit, continued to examine, continued to search for explanations that never fully came together. They labeled it recovery, improvement, rare progression, but none of it felt complete. There was always something missing from the explanation. Something they couldn't measure. They stopped trying to define it. Outside, the story spread in fragments. People heard about the boy, the hospital, the moment that changed everything. Some believed it was luck. Others argued it was something more. Debates formed, faded, returned again. The world tried to place the event into something it could understand. But inside the Caldwell home, none of that mattered. Because the truth wasn't in the arguments. It was in the quiet. Years passed, and the sharp edges of that night softened, not disappearing, but settling into memory. Eli grew, not into someone extraordinary in the way the world defines it, but into someone steady, reliable, present. School didn't come easily. Trust came even harder. But he didn't run anymore. He didn't disappear. He stayed. And staying changed everything. Noah followed his own path, each milestone a reminder of how close he had come to never having any at all. Walking came later than expected, but it came. Words followed, forming slowly, carefully, as if each one had to be earned. Their bond never needed explanation. It existed in the space between them, built from a moment when one life refused to let another end, and strengthened through years of quiet understanding. They didn't need to talk about it. They carried it with them in everything they did. There was one moment, years later, when the past returned in a way neither of them expected. Rain fell again over Chicago, heavy and relentless, echoing a night that had changed everything. Eli stood at the edge of a crosswalk, frozen. Not from the weather, but from the memory it dragged back with it. For a second, he was no longer there. He was back in the cold, back in the hunger, back in the silence of being unseen. But this time, something was different. He wasn't alone. Noah, no longer fragile, no longer on the edge, reached back in the only way that mattered, not with strength but with presence. The same presence Eli had once given him without hesitation. And Eli found his breath again. That was the moment everything came full circle. Not the night in the hospital. Not the recovery. Not the adoption. This. Because saving a life isn't just about keeping someone alive. It's about what happens after. Eli grew into someone who stayed when things were hardest. He chose a life where moments like that night weren't rare. They were part of the work. Hospitals became his world again, but this time from the inside, not the edges. He didn't chase recognition. He didn't tell his story. He simply showed up. Night after night, room after room, sitting beside fear, beside uncertainty, beside families who were standing where Daniel once stood. And when the moment came, the moment where others hesitated, where decisions felt final, Eli didn't turn away. Because he remembered what it meant when someone didn't. Noah grew into his own life, carrying a beginning he would never fully remember but would always live because of. And when people asked how he made it, how he survived something that should have ended differently, the answer never came from science alone. It came from something quieter. A boy who had nothing. And refused to walk away. And long after the world stopped paying attention, Long after the story faded from headlines and debates, something remained. Not a miracle people argued about, but a life that stayed. And sometimes, that is the only proof that ever mattered.